The Western Roman Empire. The Roman Empire did not collapse in a single dramatic event. Its western half weakened over centuries as political instability, economic problems, civil wars, military pressure, and changing borders gradually transformed the empire. During the 3rd century CE, Rome experienced repeated assassinations, short-lived emperors, economic disruption, and invasions. The empire survived those crises, but the western provinces became increasingly difficult and expensive to control. Rome also relied heavily on soldiers recruited from outside Italy. These soldiers could be extremely effective, but the Western army increasingly depended on federate groups and powerful military commanders, whose loyalty could shift. Meanwhile, political power became concentrated in competing factions, and emperors were frequently replaced. In the 4th and 5th centuries, large migrations and invasions placed additional pressure on the western frontier. The Visigoths entered Roman territory and famously sacked Rome in 410 CE. The Vandals later captured North Africa, one of Rome's richest provinces, severely damaging Western imperial finances. Finally, in 476 CE, the Germanic military leader Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus. This event is traditionally used as the date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But Rome did not simply disappear. The Eastern Roman Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, survived for almost another 1,000 years. Roman laws, institutions, Christianity, architecture, language, and culture continued to influence Europe and the Mediterranean long after the Western imperial government was gone. The Maya Civilization. The Maya civilization did not suddenly vanish, and the Maya people never disappeared. Instead, many major Maya cities in the southern lowlands experienced a prolonged political collapse between roughly the 8th and 10th centuries CE. For centuries, Maya kingdoms competed for territory, prestige, trade, and political power. Monumental cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque developed complex governments, writing systems, mathematics, astronomy, and enormous ceremonial architecture. Then many southern cities began experiencing severe instability. One major factor appears to have been environmental stress. Evidence from lake sediments and cave formations suggests that parts of the Maya region suffered repeated periods of drought. Agriculture depended heavily on reliable rainfall, particularly in areas where large populations relied on reservoirs and carefully managed water supplies. Drought alone probably did not destroy Maya civilization. Warfare, political competition, population pressure, deforestation, and declining agricultural productivity may have combined with climate stress. As rulers lost their ability to provide security and resources, political systems weakened. Monument construction and royal inscriptions declined dramatically at many major centers. Yet the Maya did not disappear. Northern cities such as Chichen Itza and later Mayapan remained important. Maya communities continued to exist throughout the region, and millions of Maya people live across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador today. So the real story is not the Maya vanished. Their classic political system fragmented, while Maya culture survived, adapted, and continued into the modern world. The Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire, more accurately called the Mexica Empire, or Triple Alliance, collapsed astonishingly quickly after the arrival of the Spanish in the early 16th century. But Spanish weapons alone do not explain its destruction. The Mexica had created a powerful empire centered on Tenochtitlan, one of the largest cities in the Americas. Their power depended partly on military expansion and tribute collected from conquered communities. This created deep resentment among many neighboring peoples who wanted independence from Mexica control. When Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, he exploited these existing rivalries. Indigenous allies, including thousands of warriors from peoples hostile to the Mexica, became essential to the Spanish campaign. The situation became even more devastating when smallpox arrived in central Mexico. Indigenous populations had no previous exposure to Eurasian diseases such as smallpox, resulting in enormous mortality. The epidemic killed many people, including the Mexica ruler Cuitlahuac, and weakened the city's ability to resist. In 1521, after months of fighting and a devastating siege, Spanish and indigenous forces captured Tenochtitlan. The city was destroyed, and the Mexica political system collapsed. But the people did not disappear. Nahuatl-speaking communities survived, and Nahuatl remains spoken today. The fall of the Aztec Empire was therefore the destruction of an imperial government, not the extinction of its civilization or people. Its collapse resulted from a combination of warfare, indigenous alliances, disease, political resentment, and Spanish military strategy. The Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, stretching along much of the Andes when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. Yet when Francisco Pizarro and his small Spanish force entered the region, the empire was already suffering from a devastating internal crisis. The immediate problem was a civil war between two royal brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Their struggle followed the death of their father, the Emperor Huayna Capac, who is believed to have died during an epidemic, possibly smallpox introduced indirectly from Europe. The war divided the empire and killed large numbers of people. Atahualpa eventually defeated Huáscar and became the dominant claimant. But in 1532, while the Inca state was weakened by civil conflict, Pizarro captured Atahualpa at Cajamarca. The Spanish demanded an enormous ransom of gold and silver for his release. Although the ransom was paid, Atahualpa was executed in 1533. Spanish forces then entered Cusco with indigenous allies who opposed Inca rule. The Inca Empire did not immediately disappear. Resistance continued for decades. Manco Inca established a rebel state at Vilcabamba, which survived until the Spanish captured the final Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, in 1572. The empire therefore fell because several forces collided at the same time: civil war, epidemic disease, political fragmentation, Spanish military tactics, and indigenous resistance to Inca rule. Inca culture itself survived. Quechua remains widely spoken, and Andean traditions continue across South America today. The Indus Valley Civilization. The Indus Valley Civilization was one of the world's earliest urban civilizations, flourishing across parts of modern Pakistan and northwestern India more than 4,000 years ago. Cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro featured sophisticated drainage systems, standardized bricks, organized streets, and extensive trade networks. Then, after around 1900 BCE, the great urban centers began to decline. There is no evidence of one single invasion or catastrophe that destroyed the civilization. Instead, researchers increasingly view its transformation as a long and complicated process. Climate change appears to have played an important role. Evidence suggests that monsoon patterns shifted, making some regions drier and reducing the reliability of major rivers and agricultural systems. The civilization's cities were heavily dependent on agriculture and complex trade networks. As environmental conditions changed, maintaining huge urban populations may have become increasingly difficult. Trade connections also weakened, and populations gradually moved towards smaller settlements. Large cities declined, standardized urban systems disappeared, and the civilization's political and economic structure changed dramatically. The Indus script remains undeciphered, meaning many details about their government, religion, and final centuries are still unknown. Importantly, this was not necessarily a sudden extinction. People continued living in the region, and later South Asian cultures inherited aspects of the Indus tradition. The mystery makes the Indus civilization particularly fascinating. We know that its cities declined, but because we cannot yet read their writing, we still cannot hear the civilization explain its own transformation. Mycenaean Civilization. The Mycenaean Civilization dominated much of mainland Greece during the Late Bronze Age. producing fortified palace centers such as Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns. These kingdoms controlled agriculture, trade, administration, and military power through centralized palace systems. Around 1200 BCE, however, this world began to collapse. Across the eastern Mediterranean, numerous Bronze Age kingdoms experienced destruction and political breakdown at approximately the same time. Mycenaean palace centers were burned or abandoned, long-distance trade networks weakened, and the administrative system that depended on the palaces largely disappeared. The exact cause remains debated. Warfare and raids probably played a role, while earthquakes, drought, food shortages, political instability, and the breakdown of international trade may have contributed. The famous Sea Peoples are also associated with the wider Bronze Age collapse, although historians continue to debate exactly who they were and how significant their role was. What makes the collapse remarkable is how quickly a complex palace economy could unravel. Mycenaean rulers depended on centralized systems for collecting goods, managing labor, and distributing resources. Once those systems failed, the entire political structure became difficult to maintain. Writing in the linear B script disappeared, monumental palace construction declined, and Greece entered a much less centralized period, often called the Greek Dark Ages. But Greek civilization did not disappear forever. Centuries later, new city-states such as Athens and Sparta emerged. The Mycenaean collapse was therefore not the end of Greek civilization. It was the end of one particular Bronze Age political and economic system. The Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire created one of Southeast Asia's most remarkable civilizations, centered around Angkor in present-day Cambodia. At its height, Angkor supported enormous populations through sophisticated reservoirs, canals, roads, temples, and agricultural systems. The empire's decline was gradual rather than the result of one catastrophic attack. For centuries, Khmer rulers invested heavily in managing water. Reservoirs and canals helped support intensive agriculture, particularly rice cultivation. But the same system that made Angkor powerful could also become vulnerable when environmental conditions changed. Evidence suggests that the region experienced alternating periods of intense drought and unusually heavy rainfall during the 14th and 15th centuries. Such extreme conditions could damage reservoirs, canals, embankments, and agricultural infrastructure. Political and economic changes also mattered. Trade increasingly shifted toward maritime routes and coastal centers, making locations connected directly to river and sea commerce more advantageous than an inland capital. Religious changes transformed Khmer society as well. Theravada Buddhism became increasingly influential, replacing some of the older royal religious traditions that had supported monumental temple building. By the 15th century, Angkor was no longer the dominant political center it had once been. The Khmer court shifted toward other centers, eventually including Phnom Penh. Angkor was not simply abandoned overnight, and Cambodia did not cease to exist. Khmer culture survived and developed in new forms. Today, Angkor's temples remain as evidence of a civilization whose political center declined while its cultural traditions continued. The Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was actually the continuation of the Roman Empire in the eastern Mediterranean. Its citizens called themselves Romans, and their empire survived for almost 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire collapsed. But by the late medieval period, the empire had become dramatically smaller and weaker. A major turning point came during the Fourth Crusade. In 1204, Western European crusaders captured and brutally sacked Constantinople, creating the Latin Empire and fragmenting Byzantine territory. Although the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the empire never fully recovered its former strength. The Ottoman Turks then became the dominant power in the region. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Byzantine territory steadily contracted. Constantinople remained the imperial capital, but it was increasingly surrounded by Ottoman lands. By the 15th century, the empire consisted mainly of Constantinople and a few remaining territories. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II launched his final assault. Ottoman cannons battered the city's famous walls, while Ottoman troops attacked from land and sea. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died during the fighting. The fall of Constantinople ended the Byzantine state, but not its cultural legacy. Greek scholarship, Roman law, Orthodox Christianity, art, architecture, and literature survived in other societies. The Byzantine Empire therefore represents one of history's longest transformations, a Roman state that survived for centuries after Rome's Western Empire had disappeared. Ancient Sumer. Sumer was one of the world's earliest known urban civilizations, developing in southern Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. Cities such as Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu became centers of writing, administration, religion, trade, and political power. Sumer's greatest innovation was not a single monument, but an entire urban system. Cuneiform writing allowed administrators to record grain, livestock, labor, taxes, and trade. Temples and palaces organized huge economic networks. But Sumer was never a unified empire for most of its history. Its cities frequently competed with one another, and political control changed repeatedly. Environmental problems also created long-term difficulties. Southern Mesopotamian agriculture depended heavily on irrigation. Over centuries, irrigation could contribute to soil salinization, reducing agricultural productivity in some areas. River courses also shifted, affecting settlements and farmland. Around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the region experienced major political disruptions. The Akkadian Empire collapsed, and later the 3rd dynasty of Ur created another powerful state. Eventually, however, Sumerian political independence disappeared as Amorite rulers and other Mesopotamian powers gained control. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Sumerian ceased to function as the everyday spoken language of most people, although it remained important as a scholarly and religious language for centuries. The Sumerians therefore did not vanish in a single disaster. Their independent political identity gradually disappeared as Mesopotamia's cultures merged and evolved. Their legacy, however, was enormous. Cities, writing, bureaucracy, monumental temples, mathematics, and recorded literature all became foundations of later civilizations. Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt lasted for more than 3,000 years, making it one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. Pharaohs rose and fell, dynasties changed, capitals moved, and foreign rulers conquered the Nile Valley. Yet Egyptian civilization repeatedly adapted. Its final political collapse came during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, ending Persian rule and establishing a Greek dynasty. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries while adopting many Egyptian traditions and presenting themselves as pharaohs. The final famous ruler of this dynasty was Cleopatra VII. Her political struggle with Rome eventually brought Egypt directly into the Roman sphere. After Cleopatra and Mark Antony were defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Cleopatra died in 30 BCE. Egypt then became a Roman province. But even Roman conquest did not instantly destroy Egyptian culture. Egyptian temples remained active, traditional religious practices continued, and hieroglyphic writing was still used. Over the following centuries, however, Christianity spread throughout Egypt. Traditional temples gradually lost their religious importance, and ancient Egyptian religious institutions declined. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Philae in 394 CE, centuries after the pharaohs had disappeared. Ancient Egypt, therefore, did not end when Rome conquered Cleopatra. Its political independence had already changed dramatically, while its religion, writing, and institutions slowly faded. The civilization's legacy survived in architecture, language, religion, art, and the countless monuments that still stand along the Nile today.